Now, let me welcome to the stage Eduardo da Silva. Eduardo da Silva is an independent consultant in sustainable evolution of socio-technical systems, architecture, and leadership. He is also a Team Topologies Valued Practitioner, TTVP, and he is a PhD of computer science from the University of Twente, Netherlands. He's originally from Portugal, but now lives in Amsterdam, the Netherlands. Eduardo, please come to the stage. Let's welcome Eduardo with a round of applause. The stage is all yours.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to my talk, last of the morning, so I hope I still entertain you before lunch. And so I was just introduced. I was going to introduce myself a bit, so you already know about me. And today I'm going to be talking about moving and thinking continuously about creating sustainable learning, designing, and decision-making in our organizations. And why is that so important? I keep on coming back to this sort of idea of being able to actually achieve more sustainable, fast flow of change. And the key idea... Everything is possible if we do this. So what's this idea? Just for us to have a working definition. So sustainable fast flow of change is the ability to actually respond fast and sustainably to the things that are happening around us. Because we are not living in a closed factory where nothing is affecting us. There are things, we are building things that are continuously being affected. And if we want to be able to respond fast and sustainably to what's happening around us, we need to invest on being able to learn what's going on, being able to design, being able to decide on how to respond to that. I tend to use this drawing just to make very clear that we as organization, so we should have, we as organization are continuously being affected by things around us. If you were at the keynote this morning, Gergi shared quite a lot of things that affect organizations, right? I was not expecting to hear about interest rates, but that affects our organization. We need to do something when these things are happening around us. But also competitors, right? New product, we need to do something to respond to that. Or technological advancements. Look at all the organizations reacting to the AI explosion. Maybe some of them shouldn't be doing anything, but we are all doing something. We are responding to that. But these things, in order for us to respond to those things, we can't anymore just rely on having someone at the top of the organization making the designs, doing the learning, the designs and decision-making. We need to be able to allow most of the organization to do that. So let's just get out of the way some definitions. When I talk about learning, what do I mean? So it's really not just about learning new technologies, but learning about the problems and opportunities that are around us. The product that we are building, the things that are happening, the customer needs, etc., etc. Designing, it's about exploring and design options that are able to address those problems or opportunities. And decision-making, it's about decide on those designs, being able to do something, take action to make things happen. And typically, we don't always think about all these dimensions, particularly when we talk about architecture. We think a lot about design, something, but we are not thinking a lot about learning, and decision-making sometimes is overlooked. And then it takes us time to respond. And this thing of learning, designing, deciding, it's something that we actually are doing all the time. But somehow, in our organizations, we still are rather bureaucratic. We take time to do those things. But this is something we do continuously. as people living our lives. So here I am, about to board my plane to go to a client in Oslo. So I live in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam. So very happy. I always take a picture to send to my kids. It's a requirement they have when I go on my trips. I need to send the picture of my plane. And yeah, so I'm going to the client. I will spend 3 days alone as facilitator of a workshop with 30 people. So there are 30 people in Oslo waiting for me for the day after. And I'm very happy because I'm going to the plane. And suddenly, I was already sitting down on my place, and I started seeing the crew going and checking and smelling this part of the middle of the plane. And they were saying, it just smells that something is burning, or there is a strange smell. So I started to become a bit worried, and they too. And they started trying to figure out, okay, what can we do here? They even called an expert on the airplane to see if he could identify the smell. Is this a smell that we can live with? And for those that know Team Topologies, do you know Team Topologies? Have you? Yeah, a few. So this would be sort of an enabling team, right? So they come here helping the crew to navigate this situation. So someone that's expert that helps the team, the people that are in the middle of the problem, to navigate that better. And the realization was, we just don't know what that smell is. So it was even dangerous for them to be smelling, because that could be even bad for their health. But anyways, so the design and decision of the pilot and crew was, well, we seem to have another plane somewhere at the airport, so let's try to get you there and get you into Oslo. So I was, okay. We were there for like an hour, but that's fine. We are about to go to Oslo, so all fine. Maybe you don't know me so well, but this is not a happy face. This is the plane that we are supposed to go, and now I'm learning that the crew ran out of time to fly that day. So, and remember, I have 30 people in Oslo that at 9 o'clock the day after, 9:30, were waiting for me to have a workshop. So now it's me. I need to figure out and find a way to navigate this. So I started moving around. I managed to find the 6 o'clock in the morning flight. And although I live 10 minutes from the airport, I decided, okay, I actually will stay at the airport. This is a hotel with a plane in the middle of the building. And yeah, and here I am at 4:30 in the morning having my first coffee. It was a very long day. And I made it. So this is Amsterdam at 6 o'clock in the morning, and this is Oslo. So I made it there, roughly 20 minutes late. Fortunately, I had some people that could start things, and this was a great workshop, and great view, by the way, of the place where we had the workshop. So this is a very simple situation, and almost every conference I do, I change the story, because these things are always happening around us, right? Just 3 weeks ago, I was in Mexico, and I had to drive in Mexico City. I'm not sure if some of you already drove in Mexico City, or like a almost 20 million people place. I have to tell you that's quite an adventure, and it takes time for you to actually learn to be a bit comfortable there. So you need to interact and learn and be able to also learn how to decide on those situations, because people just do things very differently. So we are continuously doing this on our day-to-day lives. But as organizations, we are not yet doing this extremely well, in my opinion. So we are not investing enough on doing this very sustainably. And as we saw on the keynote today, as we see in most organizations today, there are a lot of things happening around us, affecting us all the time. So if we are not trying to nurture conditions for this sustainable learning, design, and decision-making to happen, we will be struggling to respond to the environment. So think big banks having all these small new banks, very agile, very fast, responding fast to their environment. We need to do something in order to be able to live with that. So this sketch here shows a bit of the trouble we are into now, in my opinion. So over the last, say, 4 or 5 decades, the rate of innovation, market demand, customer expectations just exploded. I think 2 weeks ago I was in a conference and someone was mentioning that it looks like we lived hundreds of years of innovation in a very short amount of time. So things are happening very, very quickly. And the way the operating models we have are not changing so fast. So there is some sort of mismatch here in the middle, and this is creating some problems for many organizations. So what I'm going to be talking about today is this need really to move towards cultures, structures. So when I say structures, think architecture, think the way we organize our teams, and incentives. Incentives is about really getting people to start adopting these sort of mental models and ways of doing things that allow us to, particularly people close to problems. So think your big organization with tens of teams or hundreds. Can the teams learn, design, and decide more? Because that's essential to navigate and respond to this uncertainty and fast-changing environment that we are into. So this is something I've been thinking a lot about, writing and talking and working with clients. And this is a very basic thinking model that articulates all these ideas. So you have your customers, your environment, and what we want to have is our teams and our organization basically be able to listen and learn from that environment, and then have the conditions to build and evolve the technical products that we are building. So that learning, designing, and decision-making is owned by those teams as close as possible to the problems. Because we are doing this continuously. This is not anymore that we build this CD-ROM and we send it to the customer and then we are done. We are building products that are continuously changing, sometimes maybe even multiple times a day. So we want to go quickly through this cycle, right? So from where things are happening, be able to have conditions to respond and, let's say, update our products that we can maximize this value exchange with our customers. I think most of us can relate with that. But now, how can we do this? So what are some things that we can start doing to start getting into that? Again, I already talked about Team Topologies. So Team Topologies has been a book that was released 5 years ago, roughly. And it started providing a good language for us to think on how we organize and evolve our teams and organization to start doing these things. How can we get our teams to listen to the environment with good conditions, with the necessary platforms, with the necessary support, so that they can respond sustainably to the changes that are happening around the organization. Team Topologies is really focused on the teams. Now, how are we understanding, discussing, and improving how we are approaching learning, designing, and decision-making? This tends to, or I also, this trio, many times it's sort of when I talk about architecture, this is what I mean. It's about learning, designing, and decision-making, not just designing. It's about these three things. So, but how are we doing this, right? So how are we doing this on our teams? How are we doing this on multiple teams that are building a product together? And then how are we doing this across the organization? Say, building platforms that support all of our teams, or things that are affecting all the teams. And this is where this work that I've been working for roughly 3 years. Ideas I work with clients, I explore myself, and other people are also looking at this, are coming together in this idea of architecture topologies. So how can we have more explicit thinking models and practices to address this idea of understanding and evolving how we approach learning, designing, and decision-making, or architecture, in the different scopes of the organization. So it's not just on our teams, but across the teams. So in a sense, what I'm trying to work here is a language for us to talk about that, to be more explicit on how we understand, how we improve our approach to architecture, learning, designing, and decision-making. So by the end of this talk, you will probably count me saying 300 times that. Because that sort of complements the language that Team Topologies has been so popular and people really appreciate, that allows us to talk on how we organize our teams and how do we evolve them more sustainably. And to me, these are just some of the ideas that we need to be more explicit to be able to go to operating models that allow us to achieve this sustainable fast flow of change. So these are some of the things that we need to be paying attention to. So let's look at how could this look like. And this is just one visualization that I will use today. We can use other visualizations, but the key idea is how can we visualize and how can we talk and how can we be more explicit on how are we approaching architecture in our teams and across and scope of the teams and across the different scopes of the organization. So what you see here is a sort of a little graph where on the x-axis you see the maturity of architecture capability. This is just an example of possible levels of maturity of architecture, or say architecture topologies that we could have on our teams. How are we approaching architecture on our teams? So on your leftmost side, what you see is something that still happens in quite some places, that we are not thinking too much on how are we approaching architecture. But there is always an architecture in our systems. Something is happening, but we are just not paying attention to doing that. So probably not the best place to be, but how can you start moving forward? Some people introduce this idea of having an architect, right? Someone that takes ownership of architecture, of learning, and sort of that person is designing and deciding what should be happening. And you see here a one direction arrow. He or she will tell the team, okay, this is what you should be doing. As you can see here, this is a visualization from Gregor Hopi. He's also somewhere here in the conference. So, but you see here an exclamation mark, because this is a dangerous place to be. Because if you want to maximize the learning and sort of be able to design the best solutions and go and respond fast, these people that are working on the systems and building the systems, they have a lot of knowledge that can be leveraged. And this is not the case here. But this can be a good way if this person is sort of, for example, start coaching these people to do more architecture. We can start moving forward, and maybe someone in the team is taking ownership of driving the architecture in the team. And this may be okay for many organizations. You can be perfectly fine to do that because you are now in the team. The team is sort of driving architecture within their scope, leveraging the learning they have, being able to decide faster, not depending on some people outside of the team. But you know, when you have one single person deciding, even inside the team, this person will leave the team, or something happens to the team, to that person, and you may be in a bit of a problem. And still, all of these people may be also driving architecture if they have that skill, or they are able to do that. So what some organizations are experimenting with is that more people can be driving architecture. So it could be even anyone. Anyone could be driving architecture. And as I state here, this doesn't mean that there is no clear ownership of the architecture. So for each initiative, probably one person will be more on the driving seat of making sure this is moving forward. But more people can be driving different things. And I often get this question, no, this can't happen, we can't do that. And typically, when people are talking about that, it means that they probably jumped quite a lot of steps on building this practice, being able to practice this in their teams and in the organization. So this takes time. This sort of moving to the right takes time and explicit effort. And this is something that I want to stress on this talk. So moving towards that sustainable learning, designing, and decision-making is something that we need to be more explicit. We need to be practicing this. Cool. We talk a lot about the teams, but now what about across the teams? So these, for example, multiple teams building a product, or the whole organization, as I mentioned earlier. How are we doing this there? And this is what I try to map in this y-axis here. Like, how are we approaching architecture across the different scopes of the organization? And this is something that you can get out this map and start mapping out how are we doing this with involving the people that are working on these different scopes, say in the teams, across the teams, maybe across the whole organization. How are we doing that? This is an exercise I do with clients, so I just get people on a room, say for example, think a big organization with multiple tribes, and then the tribes have multiple scopes inside with multiple teams. You can start asking them, okay, where do you think you are in these different levels? And this tends to be a very subjective exercise. People tend to place these post-its in different places and sometimes a bit contradicting. But that's exactly what you want to start having discussions about where do we think we are. So what I do after that is basically ask them to map these more concrete and crisp elements. Because when you ask people to tell you how are you approaching architecture, each person probably gives you a different answer. But when you go into these more clear things, you start getting groups of people start seeing more clearly how are we addressing these different dimensions. This is an example from a big organization I did this workshop with, and what you see here is, again, you have like different domains in the organization with different tribes and areas, and then squads inside of those areas. And we were doing the workshop because the people working, particularly here, they say that we have no time to do anything. We are always jumping around, driving all of these architecture for our teams, helping them to have a good design so that they can implement. And this was very clear on sort of the mapping they had. And also became clear that they really need to start investing on how can we start moving teams more towards driving some of particularly design and decision making. They thought that they are already learning a lot on the team. You see the blue sticky more to the right, but they were still depending on the area solution architect to do the design and decide for them. So this was hindering them to move faster. And they had multiple areas there. And what you can see is that not all of them are the same. And this is okay. So not all of your teams, not all the areas, these groups of teams or tribes will be on the same place. That will really vary from area to area or and within the different parts of the organization. But the different teams the different groups that were doing this exercise, then they basically out of this first part of the exercise, they started seeing very clearly, these are some of the constraints. And some of them were a bit suspicious. Well, can the team really drive the architecture? Can they really design and decide everything themselves? So as follow-up, you really need to also start exploring how can you start doing that. For example, probably you hear about ADRs, RFCs, all sorts of things that you can start bringing in, that the team is doing more of that, and you as an architect or a person that's at the moment on that position that I showed you earlier, is more on the sort of just keeping an eye on that instead of doing all that work themselves. And this also, that way of working, that's going to be changing over time. So you need to start doing these discussions more often. Because basically your organization and the things around them will also be changing. So the way you are approaching architecture and the way you approach this learning, designing, and decision making will also be changing. So you need to be talking and keeping an eye on those things. To show you that, this is a very yellow slide. I will show you an example of how that changed in this organization. So this is bol.com. Anyone from the Netherlands here or Belgium? Yeah, okay, so you know this. So this is like the Amazon of Netherlands and Belgium. And what you see here is on the top, like the things they started selling, like Amazon also, at the end of the 90s, books. And then they started just adding all sorts of things. And these are the services they were building, right? So they started, for example, introducing, allowing sellers to sell on their platform. Eventually, they started handling logistics for those people, etc., etc. And here on the bottom, you see some significant events. And what I will show you next, very quickly, just to make sure we have time for some questions, is how did the way of working, the technical architecture, and the approach to architecture evolved over time. Just to show that this is something that it's continuously happening around us. So like most companies at the beginning of the 2000s, there was sort of a waterfall way of working. They had a few monoliths. And most of the architecture was driven by a central group of architects. And that was perfectly fine. So they were doing a great job, they were growing a lot, and they were fine. But then, and this is the awkwardness that I want you to be aware of when you bring these sort of discussions about how can we need to do something. So they started struggling, because at the end of the 2000s, say around 2010, we started buying a lot online, right? So we started doing that a lot. And the way they were doing this, it was not enough to respond to their environment. So they really needed to scale and go faster, because this was a really fast-moving environment at the time, and now even more. So basically, this was the architecture topology they had. So everything was being owned by this group of architects. They were doing all of those elements themselves. And this was hindering them. So they were releasing every few months. They didn't have teams owning the different parts and evolving them. And this is the big change that they addressed here. So you probably remember, so Agile, end of the 2000s, was sort of picking up. They started also investing on having truly DevOps teams. In order to make that work, they also started having them owning services or microservices. Each team owned those services and could autonomously own that. And they were also owning the architecture of those scopes. So that allowed them to basically start responding faster to their environment, particularly things that were very particular to them, that they couldn't buy out of the shelf. They needed to build these things. So this was basically the change on their architecture topology. So teams' scope started being owned by the teams, and everything around the teams, the architects, there were a few architects on the different domains of the organization, they could still own and drive those things. And they started developing this very good relationship of starting bringing knowledge that's needed to help the teams sometimes learn certain things that are happening around them to the teams. And so this really allowed them to grow immensely through these 2010s going forward. Because teams were basically capable of interacting quickly on their, iterating quickly on their scope of work. They were owning that, they were driving that themselves. They were not always depending on someone outside. Yeah, so these having, owning these services themselves also allowed for that to happen. And being able to design and decide also created the conditions to do that by themselves. But here you see sort of the number of teams, right? 30. But when we were here, as I will show next, we started being 100 plus, close to 150. So you started having a lot of teams, which was good because we were growing and they were busy doing useful things. But we still also had this product and tech silos. So we had these amazing DevOps teams really, really working well on their technical systems. But a lot of the learning was still happening by product and design outside of the teams, outside of the tech department. And something else started popping up, which is we start build things, and teams were building things that other teams also needed to be building on their system. So multiple teams were building the same things, but there were no explicit structures to have conversations about what's happening there. And the architects at this stage, they were just overwhelmed on trying to make sense of all of the things that are happening around the teams, connecting dots, trying to do their best. And we started having this sort of isolated, autonomous teams, but with a lot of dependencies growing between them. Implicit, not very explicit. So this was really, again, this awkwardness led to have big discussions on how can we address this? How can we improve the way we learn, we design, and we decide in this new environment that we are in as we grow as a company? And this is a very simple sketch of what was the evolution we introduced at that time. So basically, we stopped having all of these teams, autonomous teams, working on their own, and we started thinking, what are these things that they are building, these products? Multiple teams were building a product. So think, for example, as you come to Amazon, you have you can search for things, but you also get recommendations. Those two teams, recommendations and search, are building something to get you hooked into buying and going further on your shopping, right? So you could think of that as a sort of a product scope. They are building something that inspires you to buy. And by having those explicit scopes and having people also, say a product manager, a tech lead working here, a product architect working with all of these teams, we started addressing a lot of that implicit dependencies that were growing. And we started being very explicit that this group of people are really focused on learning how to make that product better. And they have the ability to design and decide everything that's happening inside there. So we went from that not so dark green to having these multiple scopes in the organization. So we have the teams doing their sort of owning their scope, but we started having some scopes around the teams where a product architect started taking ownership and just driving that, and there is much more explicit discussions. So this was an evolution, again, on how that architecture topology became, and I think today it's still a bit similar to this. And this allowed to to start basically addressing a lot of that, those challenges that we were having at the time. So we have multiple product teams, and instead of having all of just those microservices connecting with each other, we started having like around 40 to 50 products and clear ownership of those products. And then these sort of what I like to call enabling product architects around the teams. Just they are there not to decide what the teams design and decide what the teams should be doing, but bringing the multi-team context that allows you to decide better and learn more. And worked also together with product manager. So we also broke that silo. And And this is sort of just to show you, and these are just three points in time. So there were a lot of smaller changes that were happening over those 20 years. So this is not just like these three discrete big changes that happened. Just to get you to show that things are changing in time, and based on what was happening around the organization and changes that also were coming from within the organization, we had to start changing the way we were approaching architecture. And this is something we will be doing all the time, because our business is changing, and the way we organize our team, so think Team Topologies, that's going to be changing too. And so is our approach to architecture. And this is not going to stop. If anything, this is just going to increase. This uncertainty around us, these changes are just going to increase. So we really should be more mindful on embracing it and listen to that and be able to actually make sure that we are evolving our organization, our teams, but also how are we approaching architecture so that we go more into this sustainable fast flow of change operating models. And that's my talk. So you have some contacts here. This is a workshop where I do this sort of exercises with many other things. And you also have here a video course I did. And if you cannot read this, I will share the slides afterwards with a discount code. But thank you.
Thank you very much, Eduardo, for this amazing talk. Team Topologies is definitely something that we have to pay attention on organizations. I'll give you 30 seconds more to create more questions. And before, I'm going to give you some announcements because we are about to go on lunch break. So first of all, don't forget to feedback the session on Slido, okay? The second thing I want to tell you is to use Pine because that's the platform that the organizers are using to communicate with the attendees. The recordings of the talks will be available after the conference if the speaker agreed to that. And our lunch break is going to be from 12:40, 12:45, because we were a little bit late, until 2 p.m. All right. So in that time, take your time to refresh yourself, eat something, network, talk to our sponsors, talk to our sponsors, talk to our sponsors. And if it was not clear, talk to our sponsors, okay? All right, let's go to the questions. Jofi asked, if you do any body architecture, how do you make sure that the right skills are in place for making architectural decisions?
Yeah. So, again, this is one of the most popular questions I get around that topic. And typically, if you are doing any body architecture, it means that you have been practicing and the skills are already there. But some examples of things that you do when you are doing that are things like, as I said earlier, RFCs. But very interestingly, something that's picking up, it's something called advice process. And what does that mean? It means that if you are doing taking a design decision, you need to ask for input from the people that will be affected and people that know about that topic. This is a must thing. You need to do that. And then you will be gathering input from those people that are affected. So you listen to possible challenges that may come from that. And you listen from experts that maybe did this before. For example, introducing, I don't know, new GraphQL API. So you listen to other teams that did that before. And then you go and you can sort of decide on how to move into this. So typically, when you are there, you have this sort of processes, culture of asking people for feedback. We talk with each other. There are these conditions.
Yeah. Thank you, Jofi, for your question. Now, Anonymous asked, should new organizations go through all the stages of architecture topologies, or should it ideally empower product teams from the very beginning?
Yeah, another great question. So what I showed, those are just some discrete points in time. So there were all sorts of topologies in the middle. And I think you should try to empower as early as possible. But this will mean different things in different organizations. In some organizations, your teams may be just so used to being told what to do that they will not be able to do this themselves alone from day one. So there, maybe you need to have someone that plays that role that I talked about earlier. And if you look on my website, there is an article which is like having architects that work as an enabling team. Like their focus is really coach the teams to be able to design and decide better. So they are really focusing on coaching teams to learn more of that. So you are trying to get into that goal, but you may need different strategies depending on where your organization is. And as you saw on the example I showed you on that big organization, different teams will be in different places. So you really need to be mindful of the team and not say, okay, this is how we do it, and we do it everywhere. It's really contextual. So you need to pay attention to the teams that you are working with.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the question. What are the best ways to allocate time for learning on a day-to-day busy schedules of engineers?
Whoa, this is, yeah. Well, I could give you many ideas there, but I think, again, it's really contextual. But typically, what I would recommend you is that you, in your teams, should make this a sort of, this is normal. We are doing knowledge work, so we should have time to do some learning and be able, again, to have people on teams to do more of the design, more of the, I don't know, more of that learning that I was talking a lot during the talk. So this really needs to be developed, I think, from the team. And I talked earlier about incentives. So this is something I stress a lot on my talks, which is managers around the teams, they need to be incentivized to allow for that to happen. So they shouldn't be like micromanaging that you are spending all of your time implementing Jira tickets and you can't explore something new that would help you to do that better. So yeah, but very contextual.
I think that there are so many aspects to that question that needs to be addressed, right? Like, what are the goals, how the company measures performance, what are the objectives of certain projects, you know, what are the incentives, as you just mentioned. So yeah, it's a very complex question.
But at the end are we allowing the people on the teams to basically learn as much as they can in order to then design and build what would be the best product? I think if you keep that in mind, you will probably find how you should be doing this in your context.
Having worked in many companies in different contexts, I think that really drills down to the bottom line. Do you want to have an easy and quick win with not so much sustainable future, or you want to build a sustainable future? I mean, of course, I mean, we can go on and on about this question. Is very good. But let's ask one last question so we can finish and the guys can go to lunch, all right? Okay, so how should multiple teams navigate conflicting decisions around the same part of a product?
Yeah, so this was the issue that we started having around this time that I show. Oh, you cannot see the slides. So this was the issue that we were having at this time of the map, right? So we started having, let me show this one, at this part. So we started having multiple teams building, the product started being so big that multiple teams were sort of being affected. And by introducing these structures and rituals of having explicit scopes where multiple teams are working, you can start having much better discussions around that. And probably also ownership. So there is someone that's, in this case, a product architect that's more looking at those and facilitating the discussions about these conflicts. Because sometimes we just don't know where things should be landing. And then we start having, we get those 2-3 teams collaborating. How can we figure that out? And if you use Team Topologies language, that's literally a collaboration. So they sit down together, they talk with each other, and then they figure out, okay, this would be the best way to move forward. So having these sort of mechanisms, and in time, you can probably do that a bit informally, but in this case, in this organization, we really need to make that very explicit, because the pain was starting to be very big and was hindering many, many teams.
Eduardo, thank you
very
much for this talk. Let's give him a round of applause, guys.
Thank you.